My name is Clara Vance. I was 31 the winter I figured out exactly what a stamped manila envelope could do to a bloodline. It was my grandmother Evelyn's 81st birthday, a miserable, sleet-heavy Friday in November. She had spent the entire morning rolling out dough for her signature lattice cherry pie. She mastered that recipe decades before I even existed. The dining room looked like a magazine spread, 10 intricately folded linen napkins, the silver she only polished for holidays, and sprigs of dried eucalyptus from the backyard in crystal vases. Not a single person showed up. My mother and stepfather were wine tasting in Napa Valley. My sister, Olivia, managed a pathetic text at 5 in the afternoon. "Happy B-Day, Evie. Vineyards are gorge." My mother didn't even bother texting me. She just uploaded a video of clinking wine glasses to her social media with the caption, "Blessed." I drove 4 agonizing hours from my cramped Boston apartment, still wearing my dusty cardigan from the library archives, and found her completely alone in the dim dining room. The vanilla bean ice cream had liquefied, pooling over the edges of the ceramic bowl. She stared blankly at the far wall, her eyes unfocused, looking at me as if I were a ghost intruding on her grief. I didn't ask questions. I just cut her a generous slice of cold pie. I sang the birthday song. My voice cracked in the empty house. The next morning, while I scrubbed the hardened pie crust off the baking tins, a heavy knock echoed through the hallway. 2 men in cheap suits stood on the porch. They didn't smile. They just handed me a thick wax-sealed folder, heavily bound, carrying my grandmother's unmistakable Shatey signature on the front line. The contents of that folder fundamentally dismantled my family. People love to consume stories about ordinary folks setting quiet, devastating boundaries, where dignity finally gets to speak the loudest. If you relate to standing up for someone who has lost the ability to stand up for themselves, you know exactly how this feels. That specific Friday night is permanently burned into my memory. It feels like a physical scar. I had left Boston right at sunset, grabbing a pathetic bundle of bruised carnations from a rest stop. 4 hours navigating the slick, winding coastal roads of Cape Elizabeth, where the dead pine branches scraped against the roof of my sedan. I killed the engine in her crushed shell driveway a few minutes past 8. Only the yellow porch bulb fought the darkness. Every other room was pitch black. Stepping inside, the air felt stagnant. 10 empty chairs, the pie sitting in the center of the mahogany table like a mocking centerpiece. The numbers 8 and 1 written out in crimson icing, slowly bleeding into the crust. She sat perfectly still at the head of the table, wrapped in her faded emerald shawl, her fragile hands clutching a porcelain teacup. "Clara," she whispered, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Did I miss Sunday service?" I swallowed the lump in my throat. "It's Friday, Nana. It's your birthday." She traced the rim of the teacup. "Oh, I thought I baked this for the neighborhood potluck." We ate the pie with our bare fingers in the dark because I couldn't stomach the sound of silverware clinking in that deafening silence. I sang to her again, mainly because halfway through my first attempt, she looked terrified and asked me to start over. By 10 o'clock, I practically carried her up the stairs. She felt hollow, like a bird made of tissue paper. Her wrist was no thicker than a curtain rod, but just as I pulled the heavy down comforter up to her chin, her grip suddenly tightened around my fingers. The fog in her eyes evaporated. They went razor sharp. "They assume I don't see what they're doing," she muttered, her voice entirely steady. I held my breath, waiting for the rest, but she was out cold seconds later. "You need to understand my place in this family hierarchy. The Vances are the kind of New England wealthy that relies on passive aggression and legacy admissions. My mother, Patricia, buys historical properties just to gut them. My stepfather, Robert, manages offshore portfolios so he can spend his afternoons playing squash. My sister, Olivia, runs a boutique PR agency, driving an imported SUV that costs triple my yearly salary. And then there's me, the archivist. I make roughly $45,000 a year organizing municipal records, spending my nights studying for my master's in library science. Patricia loves to introduce me at her galas by sighing and saying, "Clara is still doing her little filing hobby, bless her." I never fought back. I just read the old documents. But this house, Evelyn's house, was my actual sanctuary. Nana taught me how to balance a checkbook at that very mahogany table. She co-signed the loan for my beat-up car when Patricia laughed at the request. That night, after tucking her in, I couldn't sleep. I laid in the guest bedroom, staring at the familiar water stain on the plaster ceiling. Around 1 in the morning, my throat felt like sandpaper. I crept downstairs for a glass of water. On the entryway console, tucked deliberately behind a framed photograph of Olivia's graduation, I noticed a thick, glossy business card. Harrison and Thorne Luxury Developers. I flipped it over. Someone had scribbled in my mother's aggressive cursive, "Projected teardown and lot value $1.2 million. I put the glossy developer card back exactly where I found it, sliding it behind the graduation frame. My fingers didn't shake, but a cold, heavy knot formed at the bottom of my stomach. Sunday morning brought a brutal grey coastal light. I spent 2 hours aggressively scrubbing the dining room while Evelyn slept deeply in her floral armchair. I dumped the ruined cherry pie into a plastic container. I threw away the dried eucalyptus. I wiped the crimson icing off the antique silver and shoved it to the back of the buffet cabinet, knowing someone else would eventually pack it up. I hated that thought. I physically pushed it out of my brain. At 10:15, the front door knocker slammed twice. 2 people stood on the porch, shivering in the sharp sea breeze. The woman was in her 60s. She wore a sharp charcoal trench coat and held a scuffed leather satchel. The man next to her was younger, clutching a notary seal in a black pouch. "Clara Vance?" the woman asked. Her voice was pure gravel. "Yes. I'm Margaret Lynn. This is David Rossi. Your grandmother retained our firm over a year ago." She extended a heavy wax-sealed envelope. Evelyn's unmistakable signature scrawled across the seal. "She instructed me to hand this to you, personally, when the time came." "When the time came for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper over the wind. Margaret glanced past my shoulder, looking at the armchair through the glass storm door. Her hard expression cracked, just a fraction. "Come to my office when you're ready. Here is my card. Do not speak to your mother or your sister until we talk." They turned and walked down the driveway before my brain could process another question. I just stood on the freezing porch. The envelope felt incredibly heavy in my hands, weighing far more than a few sheets of paper should. The wax seal was crossed with Evelyn's handwriting, the fierce looping cursive she used on my birthday cards. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Patricia. Ring camera showed people on the porch. Do not sign anything, Clara. I flipped the phone over, silenced it, and walked back to the kitchen. Sitting at the mahogany table, I ran my thumb over the wax. This wasn't the shaky scrawl of a woman losing her mind. It was deliberate. I broke the seal. A thick stack of legal filings slid out, a warranty bead, a specialized trust, a durable power of attorney, a neurologist's sworn evaluation dated 14 months ago. Clipped to the very top was a note written on her heavy ivory stationery. Clara, open this the second they try to take the house. Everything is here. I am so sorry. It has to be you. I read that short note until the ink blurred. The second they try to take the house. She didn't say if, she said when. She knew, 14 months ago, before the fog really rolled into her brain, before she started calling me by my dead aunt's name, before she started leaving the front door wide open in the middle of the night, or wandering the neighborhood looking for a dog that died in 1998. She knew they were coming for the property, and she quietly prepared for war. I stayed home from the archives on Monday. I couldn't leave her alone. I figured out their timeline when I went to drag the trash bins to the curb. There was a bulky metal lockbox clamped to the side yard gate handle, half hidden by overgrown lilac bushes. I knew exactly what it was. Real estate agents use them for vacant properties. Someone was actively showing my grandmother's home. I marched inside and ripped through the stack of mail Patricia was supposedly managing. Hidden beneath utility bills, I found a printout, an off-market tear-down listing from Harrison and Thorne. They had priced it at $1.2 million, a fire sale price for coastal property. In the hallway desk drawer, I found the actual kill shot, a blank purchase agreement. The buyer was some faceless shell company. The seller's representative listed on the bottom line, Olivia Vance, my sister. I laid the papers out on the hallway rug like a murder board. The lockbox, the tear-down listing, the purchase agreement, and a sticky note in Patricia's handwriting that said target closing December 10th, 3 weeks away. I dialed my mother at 6 o'clock that evening. "Clara, darling," Patricia answered. She used her charity auction voice, dripping with fake warmth. "How is Evie holding up? Napa was simply breathtaking." I didn't play her game. "There's a real estate lockbox on her side gate." The line went dead silent for 4 agonizing seconds. "Sweetheart," she finally sighed, shifting into damage control. "Robert and Olivia are handling that with a wonderful developer. We're setting up a transition plan. Evie can't manage that massive, drafty house anymore." "I found the purchase agreement, Mum. Olivia's the seller's agent." Patricia's warmth vanished instantly. "This is a private financial decision between me, Robert, and your sister. We have been managing her estate for months. You do not need to meddle." "Does she even know you're tearing down her home?" I asked, my blood boiling. "She knows what she can process." I heard a wine bottle uncork in the background. Olivia's agency lost 2 major clients. This sale funds a beautiful memory care facility for Evie, and it helps your sister survive a brutal quarter. It is the responsible choice. "It is her home, Mum, not Olivia's slush fund." "Clara," Patricia's voice dropped into a dark, frozen register I rarely heard. "Absolute zero. Your grandmother has advanced dementia. She left the oven on for 6 hours last week. She wandered down to the highway. She is absolutely in no condition to dictate what happens to a $1 million coastal asset." She paused, letting the cruelty settle. "Well," I said, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white, It's a really good thing I remember it for her." I hung up without waiting for her response. I grabbed Margaret Lynn's heavy card and Evelyn's manila envelope, setting them together under the harsh kitchen pendant light. Tomorrow morning I was driving straight to Portland. Tonight I had to read 50 pages of dense legal text. Margaret Lynn's office was tucked into the second floor of a restored brick building overlooking the harbour. The reception area smelled like old paper and expensive coffee. I had called right at 8 in the morning. The receptionist transferred me under 15 seconds, which meant they had been waiting for me to call. "Miss Vance," Margaret's gravelly voice came through the line. "I told the receptionist I would be there by noon. I drove the brutal coastal highway again, my windshield wipers fighting a miserable mix of ocean spray. Margaret Lynn was waiting in a heavy mahogany-panelled conference room that smelled intensely of lemon polish and old paper. She didn't offer me coffee or engage in polite small talk. She simply pushed a silver tissue box to the exact geometric center of the table and sat down. Your grandmother walked into this exact office over a year ago," Margaret began, her voice rough and dry like dead leaves on pavement. "Late September. She had experienced a terrifying afternoon. She drove to the local pharmacy, somehow ended up 3 towns over near the state line, and completely blacked out on how to get back. A local mechanic recognized her sedan and drove her home. She called my direct line the very next morning. Evelyn already knew the firm. Her longtime bridge partner had used them for a vicious estate battle. She came in completely alone," Margaret noted, tapping her pen. "She was razor sharp, and she was absolutely terrified. I asked what she was scared of. Margaret folded her hands over her legal pad. Of exactly what is happening right now. She sat in that chair and told me, 'My daughter Patricia will sell my home the absolute second my brain slips, and Robert will just sign whatever she puts in front of him.' She needed to build a fortress before she lost the ability to lock the doors." I stared at the tissue box, my chest feeling tight. "She specifically chose you, Clara," Margaret said, leaning forward so I couldn't look away. "She told me you were the only person in the family who actually understood what that house meant, which meant you were the only one vicious enough to actually protect it." Margaret opened her master copy of the file. She walked me through Evelyn's war plan, piece by piece. 14 months ago, Evelyn arrived wearing her immaculate tweed suit and vintage Chanel pearls. She brought her original deed, 2 decades of property tax receipts, and a handwritten list of questions on heavy ivory cardstock. She was brutally methodical, Margaret said. She noticed the memory gaps creeping in. First it was forgetting the names of her prize hydrangeas, then her dentist appointments, then the route to the grocery store she'd driven for 40 years. Her neurologist used the phrase early onset. She knew the window was closing fast. Evelyn demanded 2 specific things. First, protect the property. Second, appoint the exact person who would shield her when the fog became permanent. And she bypassed her own daughter entirely. Margaret looked at me over her wire-rimmed glasses. Yes, she cut Patricia out. The weight of that hit me like a physical blow. Patricia was her only child. Evelyn paid for her Ivy League tuition and financed her first wedding. Yet, when the lights started going out, she handed the keys to me. Evelyn knew Patricia operated purely on cold calculation. She knew Olivia operated on blind greed. Your grandmother executed these instruments on September 12th of last year, Margaret continued, her tone strictly professional now. She had absolute legal capacity. Her neurologist, Dr. Eris, provided a sworn affidavit that very morning, confirming she fully grasped the gravity of her actions. Margaret tapped the medical letter. This is your titanium shield. The legal structure is bulletproof. I spent my days archiving municipal legal disputes, so I recognized the weaponry instantly. First, a revocable living trust. Evelyn had legally transferred the actual deed of the coastal property into the trust. She remained the trustee while her mind was intact. I was named the sole successor trustee. If she lost capacity, control of the dirt, the timber, and the foundation passed exclusively to me. Not Patricia, not Robert, me. Second, a sweeping, durable power of attorney, specifically written to survive her cognitive decline. Third, the neurologist's ironclad letter. So the house isn't actually hers anymore, I said, the realization finally clicking into place. Correct, Margaret nodded. The property belongs to the trust. Evelyn cannot sell it as an individual, and under this specific structure, anyone holding a generic, newer power of attorney has zero authority over trust assets. Only the trustee can authorize a transfer. Once she lacks capacity, that is you. And she's already lacking capacity, I whispered, thinking about the ruined pie. She wandered onto the highway just last week. Margaret's expression hardened. Then the successor provisions are fully active right now. She paused, letting the heavy silence stretch across the conference room. Clara, you need to be prepared. If your mother or sister dragged her to a notary recently and made her sign a new power of attorney or a listing agreement while her mind was compromised, those papers are legally worthless. That warning rang in my ears the entire drive back to Cape Elizabeth. The house was dead quiet when I pulled in. The porch light flickered against the coastal wind. Through the front bay window, I saw Evelyn in her floral armchair, the television muted, her knitting needles resting idle in her lap. I unlocked the front door with the heavy brass key she gave me when I got my driver's license, the key Patricia was never allowed to have. Nana? I stepped into the dim living room. She looked up. For 5 long, agonizing seconds, her eyes were completely devoid of the usual milky confusion. They were sharp, furious, and entirely present, like shattered glass. You went to see Margaret, she said evenly. I froze by the sofa. You remember Margaret? She picked up her knitting needles. I remember I was terrified. I went to a lawyer to stop Patricia from throwing me in a home. Did I do it right? I sat on the edge of the heavy oak coffee table, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. You did it perfectly, Nana. It's absolutely bulletproof. She let out a shaky, rattling breath and placed the needles back down on her knees. They bring strangers through here on Thursday mornings when the visiting nurse is helping me bathe. I hear the floorboards creaking, people judging my dining room. I swallowed the massive lump in my throat. I know, I'm sorry. Patricia refuses to look me in the eye when she visits, her voice dropping to a harsh, resentful whisper. She just stares at the walls. And Olivia brought a massive stack of papers last month. I don't even know what I signed. I grabbed her fragile, freezing hands. It doesn't matter what they made you sign. You already blocked them. She squeezed my palms with surprising, sudden violence. I am not a ghost yet, Clara. The ferocity in her voice hung in the cold room. My sunrise, she would probably forget we ever had this conversation, but I would carve it into my memory for both of us. Olivia blew through the front door on Wednesday afternoon. She didn't bother knocking. She just stormed in, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood, carrying a massive iced coffee. She walked in expecting the entire room to bow to her. "Hey, Clary," she muttered, smelling like expensive dry shampoo and desperation. She yanked open the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of sparkling water, and leaned against the granite island like she held the deed in her pocket. "Taking a break from the dusty library gig," she smirked, saying the word library like it was a contagious disease. "Olivia, I saw the lockbox clamped to the gate. I know about the tear-down listing." Her water bottle froze halfway to her perfectly glossed lips. The smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a predatory, cornered negotiation face. "Look, I know it feels sudden, but my agency is bleeding cash. We lost our biggest tech client last month. I have a massive commercial loan payment due in 6 weeks, over 800 grand. If I default, I lose the business, my apartment, everything. So you're cannibalizing Nana's home to cover your own bad debts. I am liquidating an unmanageable asset," Olivia snapped, slamming the bottle down and stepping toward me. "The money fixes everything. Evie gets a luxury care facility. Mom stops panicking. I save my agency. Everyone wins except the ghost living in the armchair." "Evie doesn't even know what year it is," I shot back. "She just knows greedy strangers are parading through her bedroom." Olivia's jaw clenched tight. "Don't play the saint, Clara. We are family, and family bails each other out. The closing is already scheduled. Stay out of it." She marched out, leaving the front door wide open. That night, I tore the house apart. Behind a stack of old encyclopedias in the den, I found their paperwork. It was a generic, boilerplate power of attorney, dated exactly 2 months ago. It granted Patricia Vance total unilateral control over Evelyn's finances and medical decisions. Clipped to the back was an exclusive right-to-sell agreement for the property, explicitly naming Olivia Vance as the listing broker. I carried the crumpled documents to the dining table, spreading them out under the chandelier right next to Margaret Lynn's pristine legal trust. The contrast in the signatures made me physically nauseous. Evelyn's trust documents from 14 months ago were signed with fierce, deliberate pressure. The ink flowed beautifully across the page, the cursive loops sharp and connected, ending with that aggressive, sweeping E she used when she wrote out rent checks. That was the unmistakable signature of a matriarch who knew exactly how much power she held. The September documents, the ones Olivia and Patricia forced on her, were a tragic, trembling mess. The E barely registered on the dotted line. The ink skipped and stuttered violently. There were heavy, jagged pauses between the letters, leaving broken gaps where the pen had dragged across the grain of the paper. It wasn't the signature of a woman executing a complex legal contract. It was the frantic, guided scrawl of a frightened, confused old woman whose hand was physically forced down onto the paper by her own blood. They hadn't just manipulated her, they had broken her. I ripped open my phone calendar, swiping frantically back to mid-September. The date scrawled on the fraudulent power of attorney was September 18th. My stomach hit the floor. September 18th was the exact week Evelyn was rushed to Maine Medical after slipping on the kitchen tiles. Patricia had sent a breezy text then. Evie took a spill, just observing her. The hospital discharge paperwork, which I had just dug out of the recycling bin, clearly noted patient highly disoriented, intermittent delirium, urology consult advised. They had dragged a notary to her bedside and forced her to sign away her life while she was literally hospitalized for cognitive delirium. I photographed every single page and called Margaret immediately. Margaret didn't make me drive to Portland this time. She drove straight down to the Cape on Friday. She insisted we do this right at Evelyn's dining table. The massive mahogany table, scratched from 60 years of rowdy Thanksgiving dinners, now held 5 documents lined up like murder weapons. Document 1, the warranty deed, transferring the property into Evelyn's revocable trust, recorded with the county clerk 14 months prior, public, ironclad record. Document 2, the durable power of attorney naming me, Clara Vance, as her sole agent, executed on the exact same day and properly notarized. Document 3, Dr. Harris's sworn capacity evaluation, 2 clinically brutal pages. Evelyn Vance demonstrates absolute comprehension of these legal instruments. She accurately identifies her assets and clearly articulates her intent to protect them from her immediate heirs. Document 4, the fraudulent September POA naming Robert. The signature was a jagged, barely legible scrawl. No medical evaluation, no independent witnesses, signed during a week of documented hospital delirium. Document 5, the exclusive listing agreement, Olivia Vance as the seller's agent, a shadow LLC as the buyer, priced practically at land value. Margaret stood across from me, pressing her palms flat against the mahogany. The physical property has been locked inside the trust for over a year, she said, her voice dropping into a lethal register. Your grandmother cannot legally sell it as a private citizen. That September POA, even if they hadn't extorted it from a delirious woman, grants absolutely zero authority over trust assets. She met my eyes. This sale is dead. The property was never theirs to liquidate. I stared at the 2 signatures side by side, the sharp, defiant cursive of a matriarch, the broken, trembling lines of a victim. Patricia's vicious words echoed in my head. She won't even remember that house by New Year's Eve. But Evelyn had remembered. She remembered before they even plotted against her. Margaret and I formulated a strike plan. We didn't build it on rage, we built it on paper. Step 1 was securing a current, undeniable capacity evaluation to legally prove the September POA was a fraud. I called Dr. Harris's clinic Monday morning. The receptionist dumped me on hold for 15 agonizing minutes. When she finally clicked back, her voice had that stiff, defensive tightrope tone. I apologize, Miss Vance, but we received a legal request to heavily restrict access to Evelyn's files. I gripped the phone until my fingers ached. Restrict access from whom? I cannot disclose that, but the directive arrived 6 weeks ago, stipulating that no medical records are to be released to anyone except the primary family proxy. And who is that? Silence. Then, Robert Vance, my stepfather. They hadn't just forced her to sign a paper, they had built a legal brick wall around her medical care. I sat in my freezing sedan and slammed my fists against the steering wheel. 6 weeks ago, right after they ambushed her in the hospital, I immediately dialed Margaret. I called her. They locked her charts, I said. Margaret didn't even sigh. Predictable. We're filing a HIPAA override using your durable POA. Yours predates Robert's, and it designates you as the absolute healthcare proxy. The clinic faces federal fines if they ignore it. I'll fax it in 10 minutes. 48 hours later, the restricted medical files were sitting safely in my encrypted inbox. Dr. Eris personally agreed to conduct a fresh, expedited cognitive assessment. I took a deep, shaky breath. The legal system actually worked if you knew exactly how to wield it as a weapon. Patricia showed up unannounced on a rainy Thursday night. She didn't bring groceries, fresh flowers, or a warm meal, the things an actual daughter might bring to an ailing mother. She brought a glossy foil-stamped brochure, Ocean View Memory Care Center. She slapped it down on the mahogany table, landing it in the exact spot where Margaret and I had mapped out her destruction just days earlier. It is a stunning facility, Clara. Private ocean-facing rooms, watercolor classes, 24-hour on-site nursing. Nana explicitly said she wants to die in this house, I said, not moving from the kitchen doorway. Patricia aggressively smoothed the heavy paper of the brochure with her manicured hands. Evie has no idea what she wants. Robert and I have agonized over this decision. If we move her by Thanksgiving, we can have the property professionally staged and listed by December 1st. I glared at her, taking in her ridiculous cashmere wrap and designer rain boots. You're staging the house for a phantom buyer you already secured. Don't lie to me. Patricia's perfectly curated society wife mask slipped, just for a violent fraction of a second. Clara, I realize this is highly emotional for you, Patricia said, rapidly recovering her condescending tone. You've always treated this old drafty house like a shrine. But Olivia's agency is facing bankruptcy. This family needs to pull together. By liquidating an 81-year-old woman's sanctuary while she's still breathing, I snapped. After everything I have sacrificed for this family, her voice cracked violently. Was it real grief or just a masterclass in manipulation? After 31 years, I had stopped trying to figure it out. The documents are already sitting with the title company, she hissed, abandoning the loving mother act entirely. The closing is scheduled for December 10th. This is happening, Clara. Get out of the way. She left the glossy brochure sitting on the table and stormed out. I wanted to pack my bags and drive back to Boston that night. Walking away would have been so much easier. But if you have ever stood by while vultures put an expiration date on an elder's dignity, you know exactly why I stayed rooted to that floor. If you want to see exactly how a bloodline shatters at a closing table, stick around. I had roughly 2 weeks. The closing was locked in for December 10th at Apex Title and Escrow, right in the center of the financial district. Patricia had orchestrated it with terrifying efficiency. Final, non-negotiable. I sat in Margaret's office the very next morning to outline our counter-offensive. Option 1, Margaret said, ticking a finger. We file an emergency injunction in probate court to freeze the sale. It works, but it's highly public, agonizingly slow, and drains the trust. More importantly, it gives Patricia and Robert time to scramble, time to physically relocate Evelyn, time to hire aggressive litigators and muddy the waters. And option 2? I asked. Margaret smiled, a cold, terrifying smile. We let the closing happen. We walk right into the room with the actual documents. Let the truth do what the truth does best when it meets fraudulent paperwork. She leaned across her desk. If you drop the recorded trust deed and the medical evaluations on the closing table, the title company will do the dirty work for us. Escrow officers cannot legally insure a title that is in active hostile dispute. They will refuse to fund the transaction. The sale dies right there in that room. What if they try to force it through anyway? I asked. Title officers carry massive personal liability, Margaret replied, removing her glasses. No escrow agent with a pulse is going to record a warranty deed they know is fundamentally defective. This is the quiet, lethal path. No lengthy court battles, just hard evidence bleeding out on a table in front of the buyer, the broker, the escrow officer, and your treacherous family. The documents will speak for themselves. I kept rereading Evelyn's heavy ivory note. The second they tried to take the house. She didn't instruct me to scream at them or drag them into a courtroom. She just handed me the weapons and trusted me to fire them. I had 9 days. I sat in my freezing sedan right outside the Cape Elizabeth Municipal Building and dialed the state elder abuse hotline. The intake specialist sounded completely unfazed by my story. She had clearly heard this exact nightmare 1,000 times before. Different families, same brutal architecture. I gave her the raw data, an 81-year-old woman with documented advancing dementia, a power of attorney extracted while she was confined to a hospital bed. A shadow real estate listing priced well below the market rate, a sister desperate for corporate cash, and a mother orchestrating the entire slaughter. We will assign a field investigator, the specialist said, her keyboard clacking in the background. You'll get a case file number in 3 days. The closing is scheduled in exactly 9 days, I told her, my voice shaking slightly. I'll flag it as critical. I hung up and stared out the windshield, watching teenagers walk out of the library laughing. Everything out there looked so safe, normal. When I finally walked back into the house, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from Margaret. Clara, APS dipped me off. Yours isn't the first report. Someone filed an anonymous complaint 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago. That was the exact week Patricia and Olivia had ambushed Evelyn in the neurology ward. Someone else had seen the coercion happening. Someone who lacked the spine to leave their actual name, but felt guilty enough to dial the hotline. I didn't know who the ghost informant was, but their cowardice actually helped us. APS wasn't starting with a blank slate. There was already a paper trail. 4 days until the closing, my stepfather, Robert, showed up at the house completely alone. He didn't drive his gleaming imported SUV. He pulled into the driveway in his decade-old rusted Volvo, the car he used for hardware store runs, so nobody from the country club would spot him. He sat behind the steering wheel for a solid 10 minutes before turning off the engine. I watched him from behind the kitchen blinds. His posture was terrible. He looked shrunken, pathetic. He let himself in through the mudroom, exactly how he used to enter the house decades ago, before the money changed him. He didn't even look at me. He just walked to the center of the kitchen and stared at the antique glass prism hanging over the sink, watching it throw scattered rainbows across the floorboards. "She used to sing in here while she baked," he murmured, sounding like a hollowed-out shell of a man. "Ella Fitzgerald, every single Sunday." "I remember, Robert," I said, leaning against the door frame. He slowly pulled out a chair and sat at the mahogany table, resting his palms on the wood. I could see a slight tremor in his fingers. "I know exactly what you think of me right now," he said quietly. I didn't offer him grace, I just waited. "I didn't want this, any of it, but Olivia's agency is drowning in commercial debt. Patricia says liquidating the property is our only way out." His voice cracked, a microscopic fracture in his expensive facade. "Evie wouldn't want her own granddaughter to end up bankrupt." "You have the power to stop this, Robert," I told him, stepping closer. He looked up at me for one awful, pathetic second. I saw the ghost of the man who used to teach me how to tie my shoes on this very porch. Then his iPhone buzzed violently against the mahogany. He glanced at the screen. A text from Patricia. The ghost vanished. He immediately stood up, pushing the chair back. I really should go. He walked right out the mudroom door. He didn't even walk into the living room to say hello to the woman who helped raise him. I took the coffee mug he had been staring at and quietly washed it in the sink. 5 days until the closing. I drove to the corner bodega and bought a cheap, mass-produced vanilla cake. I didn't want to risk burning the house down with 81 candles, so I just stuck a single thick one in the center of the awful frosting. I wanted to make her laugh. I brought it to the mahogany table at 3 in the afternoon, setting out 2 mismatched ceramic plates and a couple of forks. "Nana, come here," I called out. She shuffled out of the den, her reading glasses pushed up into her thinning hair, clutching a crumpled newspaper. She stared at the bodega cake. "Who is having a birthday?" "You are," I said, pulling out her chair. "We're doing a do-over." She sat down heavily. I struck a match and lit the lone candle. She stared at the tiny flame with intense, terrifying concentration. She looked at it the way someone stares at a photograph they know they are about to lose forever. "Make a wish," I whispered. She closed her eyes tight and blew it out effortlessly. "What did you ask for?" She opened her eyes. They were crystal clear today. "I wished you would never leave this house." We ate the overly sweet cake with our forks. She told me the entire history of the mahogany table, how it was hauled up from Boston in the back of a rusted pickup truck in the 70s. She put her fork down, ripping my wrist. "Do not let Patricia take my table." "I won't," I promised. 6 days until the closing. Patricia initiated the smear campaign. My step-aunt Sylvia called first, using her hyper-concerned, condescending PTA voice. "Clara, darling, your mother tells me you are trying to hijack Evelyn's finances." She used the word unstable. I stared blankly at the ceiling. "Did Patricia also mention she's trying to liquidate a dementia patient's home to cover her daughter's bad loans?" Sylvia went dead silent. "It is a private family matter, Clara." "It's a matter Nana never agreed to," I replied, and hung up. Then Olivia's PR partner called, then the president of Patricia's charity board. Every single call followed the exact same script. Clara is hysterical, Clara is meddling, Clara doesn't grasp the financial reality. Patricia was aggressively controlling the narrative before I could even defend myself. I didn't take the bait. Margaret had been brutally clear. You do not need to argue. The paperwork will argue for you. But at 9 o'clock that night, my phone rang one last time. It was Evelyn's older sister, Beatrice, 84, living in Maine and absolutely vicious. "Clara," her voice cracked over the line, "I do not believe a single word vomiting out of Patricia's mouth. Evelyn called me last September. She told me she hired a shark of a lawyer to build a wall around that house. She told me to back you up when the wolves came. I'm holding the wall, Aunt B, I said. 7 days until the closing. Margaret called to finalize the battlefield logistics. Horizon, title and escrow. December 10th, 2 o'clock sharp. Conference room A. The escrow officer assigned to the file was Sarah Jenkins. Margaret's industry contacts described her as aggressively thorough and terrified of audits. The buyer was a shell company named Apex Holdings, a corporate flipper that bought coastal teardowns with cash. Their acquisition manager, Marcus Thorne, would be present. Olivia would be there wearing her listing agent hat. Patricia and Robert would attend as the dictatorial sellers. Margaret called the title company off the record and discovered a beautiful complication. Sarah Jenkins had already flagged the transaction 3 weeks ago. During the preliminary title search, she discovered the property was locked inside a trust. She emailed Olivia demanding an explanation. Olivia flat out lied. She sent a forged affidavit claiming the trust had been formally dissolved and the house reverted to Evelyn's individual name. Sarah accepted it provisionally, but noted that no dissolution deed existed in the county records. The closing was technically frozen, pending final title clearance. Olivia had built her entire financial rescue plan on a massive, documented lie. All we had to do was drop the actual public record on the table. The paperwork doesn't care about PR spin. It just sits there and ruins you. The night before the ambush, I sat in the living room with Evelyn. She was experiencing a rare lucid window. She had her crossword puzzle resting on her knees, aggressively filling in boxes with a heavy black ballpoint pen. She always refused to use pencils because she claimed they were for cowards. Nana, tomorrow is going to be a very loud day, I told her quietly. She didn't look up from the newspaper grid. 6 across, a legal mechanism for asset protection, 5 letters. I couldn't help but smile. Trust. She scribbled it in with a harsh scratch of ink. Smart-ass, she muttered. I watched her hand. The pen moved with intense concentration. The letters weren't the sweeping, confident strokes from a year ago, but they weren't the terrified, broken lines from the fraudulent September document either. She was somewhere in the middle, still fighting the fog. She set the newspaper aside and reached into the pocket of her oversized sweater. She pulled out a small folded piece of thick stationery and shoved it into my hand. It was a note written recently, for Clara, the keeper of the table. Below it was her signature, trembling but totally deliberate, the mark of a woman trying to leave one final anger before the tide washed her away completely. I am not a ghost yet, she stated. I slid the note into my coat pocket. Horizon Title and Escrow occupied the second floor of a soulless glass building in the financial district. The handles were thick brass. I pulled my sedan into the parking garage at 1:45. Margaret parked her Mercedes right next to me 3 minutes later. We walked into the lobby in absolute silence. Margaret held her battered leather briefcase. I held the thick manila envelope. Conference room A was claustrophobic, just 8 ergonomic chairs jammed around a faux marble table. Sarah Jenkins, the escrow officer, was already there, organizing stacks of heavily tabbed contracts. She glanced up when we walked in, her eyes locking onto Margaret. She recognized her instantly. "Miss Lynn, your firm isn't listed anywhere on this transaction." "I represent the Evelyn Vance Revocable Living Trust," Margaret said smoothly, not breaking stride. "We have critical filings relevant to this transfer." Sarah's pen froze in mid-air. Before she could ask a single question, the glass door swung open behind us. Patricia swept into the room first, draped in cashmere trenchcoat, wearing her aggressive society smile. Olivia marched in right behind her, clutching an oversized leather tote, practically vibrating with nervous energy. Robert trailed them like a beaten dog. Finally, Marcus Thorne, the corporate buyer, stepped in wearing a sharp navy suit. Patricia's eyes landed on me. Her curated smile didn't move, but the skin around her eyes tightened violently. "Clara," she hissed, "what are you doing here?" "Just taking a seat, Mom," I said, pulling out a chair directly across from her. Margaret sat to my right. I placed Evelyn's wax-sealed envelope dead center on the faux marble. The ambient noise in the room vanished. You could hear the air conditioning vent humming. Sarah Jenkins looked nervously at Margaret. "You mentioned you have documents?" "I do." Margaret clicked open her briefcase. She didn't rush. She pulled out 3 distinct pieces of paper and laid them on the table, spacing them out perfectly, like a forensic investigator displaying murder weapons. "Item 1, Margaret announced, "a certified copy of the warranty deed recorded with the county clerk 14 months ago. This legally transfers the coastal property into Evelyn's Revocable Living Trust. Clara Vance is the sole successor trustee." Patricia's fake smile completely collapsed. "Item 2, Margaret continued, "the durable power of attorney naming Clara as her exclusive agent, executed on the exact same day, fully notarized." Olivia slammed her hands on the table. "We have a much newer power of attorney. That old one is garbage." "Item 3, Margaret cut her off, placing the final paper down. "Dr. Eris's sworn neurological evaluation from that exact day, proving absolute capacity." Margaret stared directly at Robert. "I also brought Dr. Eris's expert assessment from yesterday, confirming Evelyn currently lacks capacity, meaning the September document you forced her to sign while she was hospitalized for delirium is legally void." Sarah Jenkins didn't say a word. She physically snatched the recorded trust deed off the table and read it furiously. She cross-referenced it with the massive file sitting in front of her. Then she slowly looked up and locked eyes with Olivia. "Ms. Vance, you explicitly submitted a sworn affidavit stating this trust had been legally dissolved." Olivia's heavy makeup couldn't hide how pale she suddenly looked. My mother told me." "The trust was never dissolved," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a lethal calm. "The public deed is sitting right in front of you. This property is owned by the trust. The sellers sitting in this room have absolutely zero legal authority to liquidate it." Sarah Jenkins dropped the deed back onto the table. She adjusted her blazer, took a deep breath, and delivered the execution order. "I cannot close this transaction." Marcus Thorne immediately closed his expensive leather portfolio and stood up without a word. Olivia looked like she was going to vomit. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "I have an $800,000 balloon payment due next month. If this fails, I am ruined." Sarah Jenkins looked at her with zero empathy. "Your commercial debts are not the concern of this escrow office, Ms. Vance." Patricia stood up, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at me. "Clara is just a library clerk. She has no authority over this family." "No," I said quietly, looking my mother dead in the eye. "I am the keeper of the table." "This is the Trust's property," Margaret corrected, her voice slicing through the rising panic in the room. "Administered entirely by the trustee your grandmother deliberately appointed, and that trustee is sitting right across from you." Olivia turned her fury entirely on me. "You are going to completely destroy this family," she shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the glass walls. I didn't raise my voice. I kept it at that dead-level conversational pitch Margaret and I had rehearsed for hours. "You tried to liquidate an 81-year-old woman's sanctuary while she sat entirely alone on her birthday, eating cold pie," I said. "You dragged a notary into her hospital room while she was suffering from delirium. You explicitly lied to a federal title officer about a dissolved trust. And you have the nerve to tell me I am the one destroying this family?" Olivia's jaw actually dropped. Her fists shook violently at her sides. Patricia started crying, not quiet, dignified tears, but loud, messy, theatrical sobs. "After everything," she gasped, pressing a manicured hand to her cashmere collar. "Everything I have sacrificed for you girls." Robert sat completely paralyzed. He hadn't uttered a single syllable since crossing the threshold. He just stared blankly at the warranty deed, looking at his mother's aggressive signature, doing the brutal math in his head. She had planned it. He realized his own mother looked at him and decided his spine wasn't strong enough to protect her. Marcus Thorne, the corporate buyer, snapped his briefcase shut. "We are entirely done here," he muttered to Sarah Jenkins, and walked out without looking back. The lying real estate agent was already shoving her files into her tote bag, desperately avoiding everyone's gaze. Margaret let the heavy silence settle before dropping the final anvil. "For the formal record," she announced, "Adult Protective Services is currently running an active investigation into the financial exploitation of Evelyn Vance. The fraudulent September power of attorney is being aggressively challenged in court. Any further attempts to encumber or transfer this trust's assets will be treated as criminal." Patricia abruptly stopped crying. The theatrical tears were still wet on her foundation, but her expression shifted from fake grief to pure, unfiltered malice. "You will regret this," she hissed at me, "when Olivia loses her entire agency, when Robert's portfolio collapses, when this entire family shatters into pieces. You remember that you did this." I stood up slowly. I slid the wax-sealed envelope back into my tote bag. I looked at my mother, at the expensive coat, the pearls, the fake tears she deployed like strategic weapons. "You do not get to dictate what her life is worth," I said. I turned to Sarah Jenkins. "Thank you for your professionalism." The escrow officer gave a tight, relieved nod. "I will document this file as void. You will receive the cancellation via encrypted email." I walked out of conference room A. Margaret followed close behind. The freezing December air hit my face the second we cleared the lobby doors. I just stood on the concrete sidewalk for 10 full seconds, my lungs burning, finally remembering how to breathe. Margaret squeezed my shoulder. "You held the line." I drove back to Cape Elizabeth with the envelope riding shotgun, resting in the exact spot where that pathetic rest stop bouquet had been 9 days earlier. The house was still standing. The dead pine branches still scraped the roof. shoulders. "It is finished, Nana," I whispered into the quiet room. "The house is completely safe." She stirred, her eyelids fluttering. Her freezing hand blindly reached out and grabbed mine, that same fragile tissue paper grip. Her eyes cleared for just a fraction of a second. "Clara, did you save the mahogany table?" I let out a laugh. A real, heavy, exhausted laugh pulled from the absolute bottom of my lungs. "I kept the table, Nana." A tiny, satisfied smile pulled at the corners of her mouth. "Good girl," she murmured. Her eyes drifted shut. Within seconds, her breathing leveled out, the crossword puzzle rising and falling steadily against her chest. I sat on the hardwood floor and looked through the archway into the dining room. The massive mahogany table, scratched and stained from decades of life, still standing exactly where it had stood since the 70s. The folder was in my bag, the ivory note was in my coat pocket, the property was in the trust, and for the first time in 9 agonizing days, I stopped counting the hours. Here is the fallout. Olivia's massive commercial loan payment hit 6 weeks later. She missed it. The bank aggressively initiated foreclosure on her boutique PR agency. She filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy by February. She had to liquidate her imported SUV. The last rumor I heard, she was working as a mid-level account manager for a rival firm, making a fraction of her old salary. She never once called to apologize. Patricia's social empire crumbled, not overnight, but reputations rot quickly in wealthy New England towns. The story leaked. Aunt B made sure of it. Sarah Jenkins kept the voided escrow file on public record. The country club ladies, the ones who liked Patricia's wine-tasting posts, suddenly stopped returning her calls. Patricia quietly resigned from the Historical Society board. By spring, she and Robert sold their massive estate and retreated to a sterile condo in downtown Boston. Robert sent me exactly 1 email in late March, 3 pathetic sentences. "I should have fought harder for her. I see that now. I am so sorry." I read it once and deleted it. Some apologies only exist to make the sender feel better about their cowardice. APS fully substantiated the abuse complaint. After 2 brief probate hearings, which my family was too embarrassed to contest, a judge formally shredded the fraudulent September power of attorney. The court permanently appointed me as Evelyn's legal guardian and executor. I deferred my master's degree. I took an indefinite leave of absence from the municipal archives. I packed up my cramped apartment and moved into the guest bedroom in Cape Elizabeth, staring at the same water stain I'd traced since childhood. I became the person who ensures Evelyn takes her heart medication, eats hot meals, and sits on the porch when the afternoon sun hits the pine trees. On a random Tuesday in April, I baked a cherry pie. Nothing spectacular. I set it on the mahogany table. Evelyn wandered in. "Who's having a birthday?" "Nobody. It's Tuesday pie." She took a bite, closing her eyes. "This is my recipe. Don't let them change it." The table held. A human being's dignity doesn't evaporate just because their memory does. And sometimes the quietest love is the only thing standing between the wolves and the door.